Imagine walking into a museum. Under the glass, perfectly illuminated, sits a centuries-old samurai sword. We instinctively picture the person wielding it as a stoic, elegant, and almost poetic warrior. That polished image is heavily manufactured. The blueprint for the Musashi we know today was actually cemented in 1939 by author Eiji Yoshikawa. He took sparse fragments of folklore and wove them into a massive national epic, essentially creating historical fiction that people mistook for biography. The historical record paints a very different picture. Born around 1584 into an era of relentless feudal war, Musashi fought his first mortal duel at age 13 against a fully trained adult samurai. He didn't engage in an honorable crossing of blades. He charged the man, threw him down, and beat him to death with a stick. To modern sensibilities, these actions seem entirely sociopathic. But in 16th century Japan, young men literally borrowed the battlefield. You fought, you killed, and you proved your lethality in combat as the sole means of winning social advancement and securing a position with a feudal lord. The violence was a career resume. You have to accept this dark starting point if you want to understand the sheer magnitude of his eventual transformation. You cannot skip straight to the revered philosopher writing about the nature of the universe. You have to look at the blood on his hands first. The mechanics of his survival are often misunderstood. Pop culture loves the image of Musashi holding a heavy, traditionally forged katana in one hand and a short sword in the other, attacking twice as fast. But swinging a sword that heavy with one hand strips away your leverage, structural stability, and speed. The true origin of his two-sword style, the Niten Ichi-Ryu, is an engineering solution rooted in his family legacy. This image shows the jite, a metal truncheon his father mastered, primarily used as a law enforcement weapon. The mechanism is highly effective. You block an incoming strike and twist your wrist to wedge their sharp blade into that metal hook, binding their weapon. Musashi took that specific trapping mechanism and adapted it to the standard long and short swords a samurai carried every day. By crossing his blades to mimic the prong of his father's jite, he effectively created a giant pair of scissors. He would catch the enemy's blade in the crux, twist, and immobilize their weapon, leaving them exposed to a fatal strike. He pushed this asymmetrical approach even further with his expertise in the shuriken. As you can see here, in Musashi's context, a shuriken is not a throwing star. He mastered the physics of releasing these heavy, straight hand blades from a distance with the kinetic power and accuracy of a strong bow. Traditional sword fighting relied on symmetrical, rigid stances committed to a single heavy weapon. Musashi discarded that tradition. He took the specific, clunky concepts he inherited and brutally adapted them to his reality, weaponizing his entire body to fight asymmetrically. Even a perfectly adapted physical technique has a ceiling. Around the age of 30, after striking down Sasaki Kojiro on Ganrujima Island, Musashi hit a wall. Looking back at a flawless record of 60 victories, self-doubt crept in. He wondered if his survival was born from a true understanding of strategy, or if his opponents were poorly trained and he possessed better natural reflexes. He realized that physical superiority is not mastery. He largely abandoned lethal matches and spent the rest of his life dissecting the psychology of conflict. He moved toward a concept called kokoro. In the Japanese thought of that era, kokoro does not split the intellect and the emotional center into a dualistic system. They are one unified engine. The practical application of this unified mind is a tactic he called attitude, no attitude. He argued that taking a predefined physical stance means your kokoro is rigid and stuck in the past. Instead, your physical posture should have absolutely no predetermined form. It must be entirely dictated by the lighting, the terrain, and the energy of the enemy in that exact millisecond. The extreme apex of this psychology is the single cadence strike. Most fighters block or retreat out of an instinct for self-preservation. Musashi's strategy dictates that when the enemy commits to a lethal cut, you completely ignore your fear. You step directly into the path of their blade, striking them at the exact fraction of a second they strike you. Stepping into the friction head-on requires abandoning fear. He recognized that true strategy completely lacks form. It is an internal state of absolute adaptability and commitment. Once he abstracted strategy away from the physical metal of the sword, he applied that exact framework to entirely different disciplines. The man who bludgeoned a samurai to death at 13 spent his twilight years practicing the intricacies of the tea ceremony and becoming one of Japan's most revered painters and calligraphers. He mastered the broken ink style, or haboku. You don't sit there meticulously sketching outlines. You splash heavily saturated ink onto wet paper using incredibly rapid, spontaneous brushstrokes. If you hesitate for a split second, the piece is ruined. It requires the exact same psychological state as the single cadence strike: absolute commitment and zero fear of failure. We shouldn't confuse this art with a relaxing retirement hobby. The professional painters of the era produced highly refined, delicate work. Musashi's pieces are constructed with tense, jagged lines. The physical brushstrokes hold a massive amount of compressed, almost violent visual tension. He explicitly viewed the ink brush and the steel sword as two instruments playing the exact same underlying music. He didn't find soft, comfortable tranquility at the end. Days before dying of illness in a cave, he wrote his final text, the Dokkōdō. It translates to the way to be followed alone, and it reads as a deeply punishing list of rules. Never to seek pleasure, never to desire material wealth, never to regret his past actions. He systematically stripped away every human comfort to maintain the absolute purity of his focus until his last breath. His trajectory proves that the way is universal, not circumstantial. Whether you are swinging a sword, holding a calligraphy brush, writing complex code, or leading a team through a crisis, the specific tools in your hands are secondary. If you master the deep underlying principles of your craft, relentless adaptability, total psychological commitment, and dominating your own internal state, you transcend the tools themselves.